Compare and contrast Lee and Grant. When we think of famous battles and great military adversaries who are outstanding in their skills on the battlefield, historians tend to link them together. Hector and Achilles and the plains of Troy, Harold of Northumbria and William the Conqueror, Rommel and Montgomery at El Alamein in the desert, Wellington and Napoleon at Waterloo, Montcalm and Wolfe at the Plains of Abraham in the French and Indian War, and of course Lee and Grant before Richmond. Now, of all of those groupings, the only two who actually met one another, both before and after the war, were Lee and Grant. They met on 4 occasions. The first time was during the Mexican War, where Lee was adjutant to the commanding general, General Winfield Scott, and Grant was a little second lieutenant. Lee met Grant, who came to the headquarters, and he admonished him because he felt that he had improper dress. The next time they met was, of course, at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee was immensely gratified and pleased that Grant offered him such generous terms. He really did. Lee and Grant had some commonalities. One was young, one was old. Each represented the societies that they stood for. Perhaps each represented also the meanings of the causes which they served. Lee, the Christian soldier, the Crusader knight, representing the Old South, the Tidewater South of noblesse oblige, aristocracy. And he was of Old South aristocracy. Lee's mother was a carter of the King Carter Plantation, the great tobacco farm down on the peninsula of Virginia between the York and the James. He was a great-grandson of Alexander Spotswood, who had fought alongside Marlborough at the Battle of Blenheim. He was related to the Fitzhughs, the Custuses, the Randolphs, Jefferson. His father had been Light Horse Harry Lee, one of Washington's fighting lieutenant generals, and he was a first cousin to 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence. Grant, the great soldier of no roots, whose weakness for liquor was well known, who had risen from nowhere, from failure and griminess, from one day trying to sell, it was Christmas Eve outside of St. Louis at a little town square. He's trying to sell a bundle of firewood and for 50 cents a bundle, and nobody bought any. And he was weeping that afternoon, and people remember that. It was a hard-scrabble life for Grant, and who set an example. He moved up the ladder of life to great things. He held out to his followers, soldiers, hoped that they, the farmers, the laborers, the craftsmen, the new immigrants, could rise to the great heights in America as he had, to lead men, to become wealthy, to become president of the United States. Grant represented surely the American dream come true. They were each generous in their estimate of one another. They were each very kind and forgiving to one another. Grant never called up the spirits of the deep as Lee did, but on the other hand, Grant was able to bring Lee to fight his fight and to eventually triumph. Each of the 2 men lived exactly 63 years. Each of the 2 men was born into poverty, each became wealthy, and then, paradoxically, each became poor again near the end of their lives. They were both self-confident, aggressive in war, and both willing to take chances, enormous chances. One is superbly handsome, the flower of a civilization which is now vanishing at this time. One is short, Grant, short, stoop-shouldered, awkward, gloomy, silent. If you met Grant before the war at a party, we'll say, and you asked him if she said hello, he wouldn't have an answer. He wasn't very impersonal young men. Each had a post-war presidency. One, Grant became president of the United States during the Gilded Age, a great time. And he made a great deal of money at that time, too. Lee, on the other hand, became president of a tiny, impoverished college out in the valley of Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, which had only 40 students and 4 professors. Grant is the son of a dirt farmer and tanner from Georgetown in Ohio, down on the river. His mother was so totally diffident to Grant that she never even gave him a name until he was 6 months old. His father actually admitted that he didn't care for Ulysses Grant. When he got his appointment to West Point and he became President of the United States, his mother never once came to Washington to visit him in the 8 years that Grant was in the White House. Because of his smallness and his shyness, his schoolmates call him Useless Grant. When he got the appointment to West Point, one of the neighbors of his father's commented to his father that, you know, it's a shame that we couldn't have found some better representative of our district to send to West Point than your son, Useless. Grant actually didn't do bad at West Point. He graduated 21 out of 39 in his class. Lee, on the other hand, was at the top of his class. He was number 2, actually, but he was very, very high grades in that class. He never got a demerit in his 4 years, the first time that had ever been accomplished. He was the president of his senior class at West Point, head of cadets, it was called, but it was an elected job. Lee married an heiress who was the granddaughter of George Washington's adopted son, Custis, Park Custis. His father-in-law owned 15,000 acres of land overlooking the Potomac River at the plantation of Arlington. He owned 250 slaves. When Lee inherited Arlington from his father-in-law, he promptly freed all the slaves because Lee, oddly, I mean, not oddly, but Lee was such a person that he did not care for slavery. He didn't believe in it. Grant, on the other hand, married a small-town plain girl. It was one of his classmate sisters, Frederick Dent's sister, who, oddly enough, had earlier had owned a slave. In fact, her father owned slaves out in Missouri. Lee's wife was always referred to him as Mr. Lee. And she had a very, very unpleasant personality. Everybody who knew her said Mary Lee was very, very an unpleasant person. Most historians believe that Lee's marriage to Mary Custis was not a happy one. Grant's wife, Julie, on the other hand, was very pleasant. She always referred to her husband as Sam. He got that name because Grant had a certain problem with names. He did not know his full name until he was 21, so it seems. He was christened Ulysses Simpson Grant, but somehow when he came out to West Point, it said his name was Hiram Ulysses first, and then it became Ulysses Simpson Grant. So he's carved that initials U.S. Grant on his luggage. The other plebes, when they saw, oh boy, we got U.S. Grant here, I bet that stands for Uncle Sam. Ever after he was called Sam. You would never have called Robert E. Lee Sam. He was too dignified. Lee was born into a gentle area of poverty. His father squandered 2 fortunes, his first wife's and Carter's fortunes, on investments. Then he ran off to Barbados in front of the debtors who were chasing him, and he never came back. He ran off when Lee was 7. He died when Lee was 12. So he was essentially raised by his mother. She said, you ought to go to West Point and become a soldier because we have no money to do any other schooling for you. He's raised in a little house in Orinoco Street in Alexandria. Mostly he took care of his mother because she was invalid most of her life. Lee became automatically wealthy once he married the heiress, and he once inherited Arlington with all that land above the Potomac. Once the war started, he fled Arlington, never to return, and he became poor again the rest of his life. Lee neither smoked nor drank alcohol, nor ever cursed or used vulgar words at any time in his life. He was a model of Christian virtue. Grant, on the other hand, smoked 20 cigars a day.